Hello, welcome to the book of Ruth from the story of Ruth in the Bible. And we're going to start off with chapter 1. So this book has 4 chapters and it's an easy read. It's a wonderful, wonderful story that reminds us of so many things about what Jesus is doing in our lives and how our story changes. So let's look at chapter 1. So the book opens up with a family, and in this family we have Elimelech, who is a man from Judah, who is moving from Judah because there is a drought there. There is no food. So he's moving from Judah to go to Moab. And with him are his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and his wife, who is Naomi. Now, when they moved to the land of the Moabites, so Elimelech dies after getting there. After his death, his 2 sons happened to get daughters to marry in the land of Moab. So the 2 daughters are Orpah and Ruth. So this is where we first come across Ruth. So Orpah and Ruth. After about 10 years, sadly, the 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also die. So this makes the only person left from this family, that is Naomi, want to go back to her people. At this point, she feels like there is nothing else for her in that land. And she also is aware that the drought that had affected people in Judah is over. So she wants to go back to her people. So she pleads with her daughters-in-law who want to go with her back to Judah to remain with their people, because she tells them, well, you are young, you can get married, go back to your people, be with them. And Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, is convinced and she goes back, whereas Ruth is determined to go on with Naomi back to her people. So Ruth says, your people shall be my people, your God shall be my God. Where you die, there I will die. So when Naomi realizes that Ruth is not going back, she is purposeful to go back to Judah with her, she takes Naomi, she takes Ruth with her back to Judah. So on getting to the town of Bethlehem, the people are like, is this Naomi? Could it be her? And when Naomi hears the women asking about her, she says, please don't call me Naomi and call me Mara. So in this case, we see the way she feels at this point, her attitude. So the word Naomi means sweetness, pleasant, gentle. But Mara, which is the name she chooses at this point, means afflicted, bitter. So that's the way she feels at that point. Now, this all happens in chapter 1. Now, in chapter 2, what happens? So, of course, when they get to Bethlehem, remember they're not from that place, they have not planted, so they have nothing to harvest. But fortunately for them, they get to Bethlehem during the harvest of barley season. So Ruth offers, and she asks Naomi, I need to go and gather some grain for us. So now Naomi sends Ruth away, and Ruth goes off to a certain field. Now, it is interesting that Ruth, before she went to gather some grain in the field, Ruth says, I will go and gather some grain in a field where I will find favor with the owner of the field. And for sure, she gets to this field, and it just so happens to be the field that is owned by a relative of Naomi. So this relative's name happens to be Boaz. So when Boaz comes to check on his workers on the harvesting and how it's going, he inquires of Ruth. He asks, who is this person? Who is this woman? And who does she belong to? So everything he hears about Ruth happens to be good news to him. And he's so taken by her. I would say that at this point, Ruth finds favor with Boaz. Without even her saying a word, Ruth finds favor with Boaz. So how do we know this and how can we see it from the Bible? So number one, Boaz requests that some grain be left for Ruth to pick. Number two, he also invites Ruth to come and eat and drink with the harvesters. And number three, he decides that Ruth should not be bothered by his young men. And he requests Ruth not to go and gather grain from a different field. And all this is happening in a situation where, Ruth is there. She doesn't see any other way that they can survive, so they have to actually she has to go and actually gather grain. And of course, at this point, she's happy that she has found someone who would allow her to gather some grain as the harvesters are moving on. So what impresses me is the blessing that Boaz gives to Ruth at this point. So he says, may you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. This ends chapter 2. On to chapter 3, what is happening? So Naomi feels like it is time for Ruth to settle down. She even asks or says, Ruth, I must find a home for you. And she starts advising Ruth on what to do. Number one, she tells her, you need to put on some perfume, put on your best clothing. She gives her advice on how to request Boaz to act as the redeemer or as a guardian to her. So Boaz, the man in this story, note, happens to be a close relative of Naomi. However, there is another closer relative of Naomi than himself. So when Ruth asks Boaz to act as the guardian, he has to do something else before he takes on that responsibility. So, and this is seen in chapter 4. So Boaz, in the presence of 10 elders, requests the other person who is a closer relative to Naomi to take up the responsibility to buy the land that belongs to Elimelech and his sons, and also marry Ruth. But the other guy is not interested. So Boaz makes a decision there and then and announces to the elders. So he has witnesses. He announces to the elders, so I am going to buy that field and I'm going to take Ruth as my wife. And he does so. So Boaz marries Ruth. Ruth conceives and she gets a son whom they name Obed. Now, Obed happens to be the father of Jesse, whom we come to later know, and Jesse happens to be the father of David. Now, from this story, we can actually see a few things that stand out. Number one is love. The love that has Ruth moved so much to accompany Naomi back to her people, leaving behind the people she knows, her country and the culture and the traditions. She's willing to go to a foreign land with a person who is a bit elderly at this point. I would suspect is an elderly person. She's willing to take care of her and go back with her. Now, that is, of course, what we term as sacrificial love. She's willing to sacrifice for Naomi, her mother-in-law. Number two, what stands out is that we have what we term as favor. The favor of the Lord is on Ruth. Note that this favor comes after Naomi, after Ruth makes a decision to go back with Naomi. So she finds favor with Boaz. Number three is Boaz acting as the Redeemer. Now, think of the Redeemer that we all know, Jesus Christ, the person who changes our story, the person who provides for us, the person who acts as our protector. So we see this in Boaz. And number 4, of course, is the fact now that Ruth, a Moabite woman, a woman from a different country, happens to be now part of the genealogy of Jesus. Isn't that amazing? So that is the story of Ruth. I hope you have enjoyed it and I hope you have learned something with me. Bye-bye and stay blessed.